And some would say, oh, it seems to reflect a time where the church, where things were developing. I mean, even conservative scholars would say that. So it's not merely a question of do I believe in the supernatural. It's also kind of paying attention to the world and the way people were thinking and writing and such. So dating's a complicated thing.
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Elisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today we're joined by someone who's no stranger to the Jude 3 Project podcast. He hasn't been on here in a while, but he's been on here several times. If you've been rolling with us for the duration of the podcast, he's a familiar face. Dr. Dennis Edwards. Welcome, Dr. Edwards.
Oh, it's so good to be with you again, Lisa. It has been a while, but I'm so grateful for the ministry that you've been doing. Thank you.
Well, for those who don't know who you are, maybe new to seeing you, just tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Yes, I'm a product of New York City, grew up in New York, and then after getting an engineering degree, I felt the Lord was calling me into ministry. Wasn't sure what that meant, but I wound up becoming a pastor. Planted a church in Brooklyn, New York, and then I'm from New York City, and then I served churches in Washington, D.C., and along the way got a doctorate in New Testament and was an adjunct professor for years. Most recently, I've been a full-time professor at North Park Theological Seminary, and this past year I became the dean of the seminary.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to have you on to talk about something that's your specialty. We're in this series, Can We Trust the Bible? And today we're going to talk to you about the New Testament. You are a New Testament scholar, so I'm excited to have you on about why we should trust the New Testament. Right. One of the challenges, I think, for people understanding the Bible or the trustworthiness is them not really understanding how we got the Bible to begin with. We talked a little bit with another professor on the Old Testament, Dr. Eric Redmond, on how we got the Old Testament canon and why we should trust the Old Testament canon. But when we think about the canonization of the New Testament, can you talk about the process of canonization? And even, well, starting before the process of canonization, can you just tell our audience what it means when we say canon?
Yes.
And then talk about the process of canonization.
Yes, very good. I'm so glad that you had Dr. Redmond on. He's a friend, and I really appreciate his work. When it comes from an Old Testament perspective, there's a long tradition, right? So he could appeal to that. But the word canon itself means rule or standard. I mean, it has application even outside of the Bible, but in the context of the Bible, it does mean those books that we hold as the standard, the rule, as it were. I'm glad you used the word process, because some people think of canon as an event, that people just sat around and took a vote. I mean, there was certainly some deliberation, but think of it as a process. There were basically three main issues that the early Christians were thinking about as they worked on this. I mean, one of them was the notion of apostolicity, you might say, or how these writings were connected to the apostles. So keep in mind, from a pragmatic standpoint, the apostles, they were human, so they started to die off. But early on, we had an oral tradition, right? The stories about Jesus, we had people talking about it. We had these letters start to get written. So how these writings were connected to apostles was very important. Also was important the notion of how broadly the writings were accepted and utilized is probably a good way to say it. So some people call that Catholicity, but Catholic means universal. So how universally these letters were, or these writings were being employed in churches throughout the then known world, as it were. So that would be the Roman world, in essence, moving from the east to the west or west to east. So you've had how broadly these letters and these other writings were circulated. And then also what we might call the rule of faith. I said earlier that canon means rule or standard. they had a Latin term for this, the regula fide, is like how
Mm-hmm.
much these writings would be representative of the way the Christian faith was being practiced in the first, few centuries. Now, I don't want to get ahead of any other questions you might ask, but the reason why the rule of faith fits into this whole thing as a process is you did start to have some writings that started to compete with things that had come through the oral tradition about Christ. So, in other words, writings that were Gnostic or writings that were coming out of other places. So that also kind of compelled the Christian community to say, hey, what do these writings really represent our faith?
Mm-hmm. No, that's extremely helpful because on the episode we had with Dr. Vince Bantu, he was talking about the distinction between the Protestant Bible and the Ethiopian Bible, and then he talked about the Deuterocanon and then
Yeah,
Enoch, the Book
that's
of
fast.
Jubilees.
Well, that's fascinating. I love that.
But he made a distinction between like what Maccabees, with a distinction between the Deuterocanon versus the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas,
Yes,
the
yes.
Gospel of Mary Magdalene. That
Right.
the churches, historically, all were like, no, these are outside of what we would deem canonical.
Right.
Versus there was some variation around Protestant and Catholic on the Deuterocanon, and then with the Ethiopian Bible, the Book of Jubilees and Enoch. Can you speak a little bit more? He talked a little bit more about it, but he made a caveat. I'm no Bible scholar.
Okay.
So for you as a Bible scholar, can you speak a little bit about why there's a rejection of those books? Because sometimes people could see those books and say, well, they're telling us that we should reject these books, but are they trying to hide some secret information from us?
Well, that is the part of the challenge, because I think it's fair to say that the early church did not put the energy into copying and and reproducing those kinds of writings. In fact, they probably actively worked to destroy them. Things that were not representative of the regula fide, of the rule of faith, they saw as heretical and didn't see any need for them to be around. And it wasn't even until the mid to later 20th century. I mean, we're talking the 40s and 50s that some Gnostic texts were found, the Nag Hammadi texts. So we do have books like, Gospel of Thomas and some of these other writings that got a lot of sensational activity with the Da Vinci Code. So these writings that were found later to be Gnostic, and certainly not written by the people whose names are on them. I mean, Thomas didn't write the Gospel of Thomas; it would have been way too late. So the early church actively suppressed those writings, and that's the part that for some people sounds conspiratorial. But the reality was they presented a picture of Jesus that was not consistent with what had been revealed through the apostles and through the oral tradition associated with Christ. So from their standpoint, trying to put myself back, those centuries ago, from their standpoint, they wanted to raise up something that reflected the faith and to downplay these things or even get rid of these things that did not reflect the faith. I know from later generations we can look at that and say, well, that was conspiratorial. I think it's somewhat similar to how we think about catechism or those kinds of things today. We might say, well, I want people to understand the faith that we've passed down. In fact, the very title of your ministry, Jude 3, the faith that had been once delivered to the saints, as it were, is the thing that was being taught and propagated. So when other ideas come in, you have to say, wait, this is not what we've been teaching. So let's hold up what we have been teaching. So yeah, I think that would work for, say, those Gnostic texts that came later, 2nd century and later. The deuterocanonical texts, they flow from a Jewish tradition. You have Jews who are dispersed, part of this Hellenistic influence, a very Greek influence. So they're writing various documents that, maybe it's an oversimplification, but to some degree to bolster their faith while they're in these trying times, under Greek rule. So they have a role of bolstering faith, but even the Jewish canon does not include them, and the Protestants often did include those books, but not as in the same level as the 27 in the New Testament. So you had early versions even of the King James had the Apocrypha in them, had those so-called deuterocanonical books in them, but they were not held to the same level as the rest of the canon.
Yeah. So if I'm getting you correctly, the deuterocanonical books were in early versions of the King James.
Yeah.
But people already knew instinctively or by tradition that this is kind of not held to the same level as the other books. Is that what you're
Well, I'm saying
communicating?
some did.
Some did,
Not
okay.
all Christians, because, clearly the Orthodox Church, they've kept some. The Roman Catholic Church keeps them and calls them deutero, secondarily canonical, so and includes them in lectionary readings. Protestants at some point said, no, these are not canonical, so they didn't include them in lectionary readings or in practice in the life of the church, and so they were not held. In fact, that's going early on. So just to put things in perspective, even early on, the church. When I talk early on, I'm talking like in the third, fourth centuries. They're not necessarily relying upon those books in the same way they relied upon the Old Testament scriptures and then came to rely upon what we call the New Testament. They were aware of them, but they did not rely on them the same way that they did those other writings. So that's why they could be in a secondary position. I don't want to muddy the waters, but for example, we know about Hanukkah from Maccabees, right? But Hanukkah's mentioned in John's Gospel. So it's the festival is mentioned even though we know of it because of a deuterocanonical book. So it's to say that it was in the world of Jewish people, even if they were not reading those books the same way as the rest of the Old Testament or as the canonical Old Testament.
No, that's super, super helpful and clarifying for our audience. Okay. When we think about the New Testament, and one of the reasons this question is very dear to my heart is because I probably wouldn't be an apologist had it not been for my intro to New Testament class at the University of North Florida.
Awesome.
Where my professor said the first day of class, I'm going to change everything you thought you knew about Jesus.
Wow.
And our textbook was Bart Ehrman's Intro to New Testament.
Okay.
So growing up, PK, immersed in church.
Yeah.
And my first exposure to New Testament scholarship was Bart Ehrman.
Yeah.
Was a very stark difference between
Sure.
what I grew up learning and what Bart presented.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I realized or struggled with really as it relates to the reliability of the New Testament going through that class was the dating of the Gospels. I think I don't know if we played the telephone game or that was given as an illustration. I can't remember. But I know the telephone game was brought up where if you tell somebody something and then it goes around the class, by the time it gets to the last person, it's going to be completely different. And then the question was posed, if this is an oral faith in which a lot of things and beliefs were communicated over time, then can we trust that what we have written down is what actually happened? And that is really one of the things in which Bart and others who follow him try to use to poke holes in the reliability and the trustworthiness of the New Testament, especially because the New Testament is so crucial. The Old Testament is crucial, but the New Testament is also crucial because it holds the really central portion of our faith, the resurrection of Jesus. And so if you can poke holes in the reliability of the New Testament, you start poking holes at the fact that would Christ really rise from the dead, which is the central event of our faith. How should we think about the dating of the Gospels in particular?
Well, that's great. I mean, there's a lot there in your question. For one, I'll say this. I won't pit myself up against Dr. Ehrman. I actually have huge respect for his work in textual criticism and such, but I do think, unfortunately, a skeptical view of the New Testament has soured some people on its reliability. Unfortunately, I would say this, that let's take a simple example. Let's say we lost the original Declaration of Independence. Just say that. That's not. This is not a Nicolas Cage movie or something. Some National Treasure or whatever. But let's say we lost it. We could easily reconstruct it because there are so many copies around of it. But also, some people have it memorized. Straight out. This is not, what is it, that Denzel Washington movie, Book of Enoch or whatever, Book of Eli, but it's not that. But it's to say that even after 200 and something years of the Declaration, existing, we could reconstruct it without a problem. You have even less time passing by from the events of Jesus to when they get written down. So there's a tremendous amount of just human ability to do this. You also have people who are verifying this. The other thing that verifying this, meaning the stories of Jesus. So by the time things are getting written down, apostles are still alive, but they might be close to the end of their life. So which is the reason why you do write things down. So if Paul's letters are, say, in the 50s, or starting in, let's say, the AD 50s or 50 CE, then the Gospels are coming, say, some 20 years later, around 70 or so. Those stories of Jesus have been circulating for a while and have a certain coherence to them that the early church could then say these 4 writings represent the story of Jesus well. I guess what I'm trying to say is not a whole lot of time passed from the resurrection of Jesus to the writing down. The other thing, Craig Evans, one of a scholar who's actually debated Bart Ehrman in certain circles, he has talked about how even early writings, we have a sense that because we don't have the originals, because they wore out, that it was a long time before we got a copy. But he says, no, those early writings could have lasted quite a while. So even while you have copies, there's an overlap. In other words, originals were existing while you were making copies. So just because we have a copy, say, from, let's say, 2nd, 3rd century, doesn't mean that it got written well after the original, if you follow my saying. It was written while there was an original. And as things started to disintegrate, you have more and more copies. So I guess what I'm trying to say is not a lot of time passed for people's memories and the reality of the experience to be written down in the Gospels. But even prior to that, we've got even less years, like 20 or so years, for Paul to be writing letters reflecting on the ministry of Christ and applying it to these churches' lives. 20 years is nothing when you think about, like, my Declaration of Independence example of 200 or so years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, that's helpful to think about that. I think when I was looking at the dating, I remember I haven't looked at Bart's that New Testament book in a while.
Okay.
But he would date the writings of the Gospels way ahead of someone, for example, like Dan Wallace. So what was really helpful for me, I think, in understanding, as far as being a person first exposed to New Testament scholarship, was understanding there is a variety of dating hypothesis in scholarship. And so going into scholarship as a student, when you have no previous exposure to scholarship, if your professor is a PhD in New Testament, and you have no frame of reference, it can be intimidating. And so you get a book, and you say, well, this is what scholars say, without realizing scholars say a lot on a number of different things.
That's right.
And so it was really helpful as I read, like, Dan Wallace and Bart Ehrman had a debate on the New Testament, and to hear Dan Wallace's perspective versus Bart Ehrman, you can see both are PhDs in the New Testament, both have done tons of research, and they both land on 2 different dates. So just because someone has a PhD in New Testament doesn't mean all of their scholarship is something we should hold on to. We can learn from, but
That's right.
also in conversation with other scholars.
Yes,
And
that's
so
right.
that
That's
was
right.
one of the most helpful things
Yeah.
that I learned from that experience. Being exposed to both sides helped me to really understand the diversity of thought
Yes.
on something like the dating of the New Testament.
Well, that's a powerful example, and you're right. I mean, people who are reading might not have, who are listening might not have the time to read all the stuff that, that we in scholarly circles have to read or wade through. But your point is well made. Is that there are going to be, I mean, we're dealing with hypotheses. We're dealing with speculation because we don't have like somebody writing the date up in the right hand corner and telling us,
Yeah.
we don't have a document like that. But at the same time, our faith and our commitments do factor in, because if I'm cynical from the start, then I'm going to say, well, this can't be reliable. And I don't have, but I have the same data in front of me that somebody else has. I think one of the things that to keep in mind when it comes to the Gospels, a lot of the questions about dating relate to the prophecy passages about the destruction of the temple, which happened in around AD 70. So that's why the dating of the Gospels is a big question, because if you think Jesus predicted it, then those Gospels could have been written before 70. If you think that the Gospels are reflecting back on something, then they could have been written after 70. So I tend to tell my students we're still talking around 70. So that was clearly a cataclysmic experience for Jewish people at this time. So, but even around 70, that's still just about 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Not a lot of time when you consider the culture and the simple storytelling culture. It's not a huge amount of time to distort things. People were putting their lives on the line for this, right? And that's the piece that we've talked about maybe at different times in Christian history and maybe gets overlooked these days. But it's not as if the apostles ever presented themselves really as trying to deceive anybody, but rather they were zealously communicating a message and even put themselves on the line, their lives on the line for that. So I think that's an important part of it, that while they were alive, they were trying to communicate something about Jesus that they had experienced that got written down.
No, that's super helpful. And I love that you mentioned that dating portion, because my professor mentioned that in class, and it really struck me about the fall of the temple.
Yeah.
Because it's like, if it really hinges on what you believe about Jesus and his ability.
Yeah, I think
To some degree, if you, like you said, if you believe that Jesus can predict the future, which he can because he is God in the flesh.
Yeah.
And if you believe that, like Ehrman, who at the time he was agnostic, and I
Right.
think he's leaned, from what I hear, towards atheism. I'm not completely sure.
Yeah.
He's not going to believe that Jesus can predict the future, so he's going to date. Even just, I mean, there's other elements to, I don't want to
That's
diminish
right.
his
That's right.
argument down to this
Right.
one perspective.
Right.
But what would drive that argument for Ehrman is he does not believe that Jesus is divine. So if you strip his divinity, he doesn't believe that Jesus can predict the future. So automatically, when he sees Jesus make that prediction about the fall of the temple, he's going to date it post. He's going to date the writing post then.
Right.
Would you think that's a fair
Yeah,
thing
I
to
think
say?
that's true. I think that's true of scholars who want the Gospels to be late. And when I say late, I mean toward the end of the first century or even into the second century. That's one part of it. It's the where the prediction passages come in. There are other factors too, though. I mean, you have issues related to how the early church started to think about Jesus and talk about Jesus. Even among more conservative scholars, they would understand, say, the Gospel of John to be later than the Synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because of how a somewhat, I was going to use the word sophisticated, that might not be the best word, but how clearly Jesus is portrayed as divine, when I wouldn't say it's unclear in the other Gospels, but it's it's stark in John's gospel. And some would say, oh, it seems to reflect a time where the church, where things were developing. I mean, even conservative scholars would say that. So it's not merely a question of do I believe in the supernatural. It's also kind of paying attention to the world and the way people were thinking and writing and such. So dating's a complicated thing. However, to the bigger point here is the reliability part. It's not so much just when something got written. It's how much can I trust what was being communicated. And for that, I think there's a lot of things. I mean, Craig Keener has a book he calls a Christobiography, I think, something like that, where he makes a case for how reliable the Gospels are because the Gospel writers were writing, in a sense, a kind of a biography of Christ. They weren't just propagandists, trying to drive an agenda. They were trying to tell a reliable story about Jesus. So there's something to be said for that, about how these writings emerged. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. When we think about New Testament scholarship, and reliability, there's something comes up that we had to wade through in school, and this is also something we dealt with in New Testament when I took it in seminary.
Okay.
The synoptic problem.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Can you tell our audience what the synoptic problem is, and how do we kind of make sense of it?
It's unfortunate that it's called a problem, but because it already seems to come at us as cynicism. But it's when you've got three synoptic gospels, and synoptic, by the way, means they look alike. The Greek prefix syn, syn, often can be translated with or together, and of course the optic part is how we view it. So they look alike when we put them together. In other words, they tend to flow the same way. But there are some pieces that are different than other pieces. For example, we do at Christmas time, we throw everything together, but the Christmas story is different in Matthew than it is in Luke. And of course, Mark doesn't say anything about the birth of Jesus. So that's an example of what people might call a synoptic problem. You have these three gospels that tend to go in the same order, yet, two of them have a birth story about Jesus and they're different. So how do we deal with that? There are a couple of things to keep in mind. The Gospels emerge out of a particular context, meaning there's an audience. All the New Testament writings emerge out of a context. And that's the thing that sometimes gets missing in our conversations about the Bible, at least about the New Testament. The context is important, the people to whom these writings are given and the people behind the writing of them. The circumstances that they're going through kind of helps to flavor why you write something. And also maybe the writer, I said earlier, their agenda wasn't propaganda, but they did have agendas. They had agendas to try to demonstrate who Jesus was. So, for example, coming back to the birth stories, if Matthew wants to tell you something about Jesus that relates very specifically to the way things were happening in his Old Testament understanding, he presents certain things about the life of Jesus. And Mark might present other things because he has some other point he wants to make. So the problem only exists in that they're not identical. The other part of the problem is when we have what so-called problem is when we have two stories that are together, but they vary in points. This I'll give you one quick example. It happens in Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel. So Matthew tells the story of a centurion whose servant gets healed. Luke tells the story of a centurion whose servant gets healed. They're both have an interchange with Jesus where they implore Jesus to, he doesn't even have to go to the person's house. He says, I know how authority operates. You can just say the word and my servant be healed. So some of your listeners might remember that story. But in Matthew's gospel, he's approached by the centurion. In Luke's gospel, it says that there's these synagogue rulers who come and talk to Jesus on behalf of this centurion. So already you've got a difference in how the story is being told, even though it flows pretty much the same way, and there's some difference in wording. So what does that mean? It means that we've got oral traditions where some parts of that story are emphasized for it in Matthew's world as it gets told, and some other parts of the story are emphasized in Luke's world. Now, if you're cynical, you can say, they don't match up exactly, so that means that somebody made it up. Actually, I think it's better that they don't match exactly, because to me that adds a strength to the story, because it's saying, oh, Luke's people heard this story and certain elements got highlighted because he wanted to emphasize some things for his audience. Matthew similarly. So for me, that actually adds veracity, because if I told you the exact same story in two different places, and it would be like it would be like somebody who did a crime and turns to their friend and say, look, let's get our story straight so we can tell the exact same story. And when you have everything line up exactly the same, there's more skepticism than things that vary in spaces that show that there's a flavor to those stories, or a nuance to them, or even a detail to them that to me heightens the authenticity. So the problem is resolved by thinking in terms of what's the context, meaning who are these people writing for, and then what's the author's sort of theological and historical kind of agenda, like what do they want to emphasize. So even in our interchange today, somebody listening to it, a month later might zero in on one or two things that we said and say, oh, that's what the podcast was about. And somebody else will zero in on a couple other things and say, that's what the podcast was about. And they'd both be right, because they were emphasizing different aspects of the very same event.
Yeah. No, that's extremely helpful, and I think important for us to note, because when you're coming from a critical lens, like you said, those will be ways in which you discredit the reliability of the text.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at it really as, like you said, this simple illustration of when somebody listens to this podcast, they summarize it a completely different way than another person, and they both are telling the story correctly. They're not trying to deceive the hearer.
Right.
And I just think about, even when I communicate as a person that speaks regularly, I tell similar stories, but depending on the audience, I'm going to tell it differently.
That's right. I
think about this Sunday, I preached at a black church. I told a similar story than when I did a lecture at a all white seminary. I told the story completely different, and I emphasized different parts of the story because I knew that the audience that I was communicating was different, and what was going to land on them was different. Preaching at a black church, there's a way in which art to it. Preaching at a black church on a Sunday morning, especially, it's an art to communicating the message. Lecturing at an all-white conservative institution is a way in which you have to frame. You could be telling using the same illustration, but you frame it differently, the elements you add to it, because you understand the audience and you understand that everybody's not going to receive the message the exact same way. So you have to kind of play to the audience that you're talking to, not to manipulate them, but to make sure the message gets to their individual perspective.
That's actually a great example. I'm laughing because I've shared those experiences, but I think it's something that reinforces the notion of context that I was been pushing. Any New Testament scholar you're going to get on here, we will all be screaming, context, because for us, that's really the secret thing that doesn't always get felt by modern day readers. Modern day readers, obviously you buy a Bible, it's all the books are put together already, everything is collected, and we can actually be quite random with it. Read one verse here, read one verse there. But that doesn't necessarily show us that the story behind it, of how, say, just to pick on Paul and the Corinthians, when he's writing a letter to the first one, or what we call First Corinthians, he's writing a letter to these people, that there's already been some drama going on, and we find out in chapter 7 that he's writing a letter that's a response to a letter they wrote to him. So that there's this conversation that's been happening, and we got part of it, and the church felt like we should save that and pass that on for more people to be able to read that part of the conversation. But even in doing that, it forces us to say, hey, what might have been happening in their world, right? So coming back to the whole synoptic question, that's still a fair question. It's not just random stories about Jesus. It's stories about Jesus told with respect to the people who are getting those stories. And I think the early church in its wisdom said, we need more and not just one. So they took 4 stories about Jesus because they've emphasized different aspects. And even though there's a similarity, of course, they emphasize different aspects, and they're told in different ways at certain points that respect the audience. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of examples of that, but your example of just how we preach and tell stories today, I think, is a good illustration.
Yeah, that's super helpful. As we're going through and thinking about the Gospels and the reliability of them, I won't get into everything that we learn because I could go into the Q source, all of those things, but I won't. I don't think that's relevant for our audience today for this conversation. But one of the things that I think is important when we talk about reliability is 2 things: the longer ending of Mark, the ending of Luke 7 going into 8. And so I had some years ago, I had Dan Wallace on, and he says, awesome. The story of the woman caught in the
that's
act
John
of adultery.
7 going into 8. Yeah.
Oh, John 7. I'm sorry, I said Luke.
But it's jumped around. It's been in different places.
It's been in different places. He said that is, he would argue, one of the most famous passages of scripture that's not actually in the Bible. Because he says he argues that it came later. Yeah. And then the longer ending of Mark, and if people, when you read the end of Mark, you will see it noted in almost everybody that I've seen that this is added later. Right. So how do we make sense of the reliability when we think of those 2 passages, that end of John 7 going into chapter 8, and also that ending of Mark? Right.
That's great. Those are good examples. It's under the broader category of something I mentioned loosely earlier, something called textual criticism, which is when New Testament scholars are comparing all these ancient documents, and really all they're trying to do is say what seemed to be the first one, what explains the others. So when we say first one, we mean closer to the original, right? So textual criticism says, hey, what's closer to the original? And when it comes to those stories, particularly, let's just say the ending of Mark's gospel, it seems like for after verse 8, that was added on later, which means that Mark, or at least Mark, didn't write that. Doesn't mean that it's not like true, but it does mean that Mark didn't write it. So the question is really originality. It's not authenticity. So, but the question really is, what do I do with that, right? I mean, so I'm trying to understand that it meant that scribes were involved in this process. It meant that when I have a document and I'm copying it over and copying it over and copying it over, at some point, something gets either inadvertently left out or added, like if I miss a letter or I spell something differently, which there's a lot of that in the New Testament, which you can understand, see that human element. But what about a big chunk like this, when there's big chunks? So it says to me that some scribe got a manuscript, and it ended so abruptly at verse 8, they felt like, oh, we need to share more. Now you could say, wait a second, were they trying to deceive us? Or did they see their job as trying to help us? And it depends on how you think about the scribes. So now, mind you, this is happening before we have something called canon necessarily. So if I'm thinking that my job is to help educate people in the scriptures, and there's a piece that I feel like, oh, this would be helpful if they understood this, and they added that on, that they may have seen their job as helping to clarify something that was misunderstood, and didn't see themselves as tampering with something that was so holy they couldn't touch it. But So I guess what I'm trying to say is we could think of the scribal hand as not a hand of deception, but as attempts to clarify. And in their attempts to clarify, they were added in after those original documents, of course. So what I do with them is I like the way the modern translations do them. They put them in notes. And then when I talk to people about this, for some people who grew up on the King James like I did, for some people it's frightening because it says you're messing with my Bible because I only know this much. But for other people, they realize, oh, there was a process here. There was a process of copying and copying and copying, and there was also a process of trying to clarify and trying to clarify. So part of my fun when I do this, because it's kind of fun to me, is to imagine, wow, what were the scribes trying to do in what were they trying to clarify? Like, what was the thing that's fuzzy? So it helps me to go back. And so for Mark, it's clear. I mean, the women run away afraid, or they leave afraid, and they're supposed to go back to Galilee and tell the disciples. And you would think, well, wait, I'm at this cliffhanger. And for some people, they don't like cliffhangers. And some scribes said, look, I know John has a version, or I know Luke has a version. Let's explain some of what happened here, so people aren't left with the cliffhanger. So it was, I can't say I know the mind of the scribe, like to know their motivation, but additions seem to be corrections or attempts to clarify. Maybe I shouldn't say corrections, too strong a word, but attempts to clarify or to share more of the Jesus story, like in the case of the woman caught in adultery. That story floated around. It's been in different Gospels. So it clearly seems, I say clearly, but most likely was a later story about Jesus that some scribes felt like needed to get fit into the Gospels somewhere. We've got this great story about Jesus. It's got to fit somewhere. So it was kind of generated that way.
Mm-hmm. No, that's helpful. I think the more maybe somebody that may be more cynical would say, if they added those, what else did they add?
Sure.
And why do you need to add? And then I could see somebody that grew up KJV and, have this kind of don't mess with my Bible thinking about Revelation. If you add anything to this book,
that's right.
Right. then there's going to be serious problems for you. You're a very problematic individual. And so coming from those two extremes, you have those extremes about, like, if you add something, this is discredited because, thinking about the Revelation passage, and then also thinking about a more cynical person would be like, what else did they add? This seems like if you feel like this is like a commentary for the end of Mark for clarity, right? Can I really trust Mark? Because essentially this goes into all of these things and when I was exposed to it as a freshman, not freshman, I think I don't know what year I'm in. Maybe sophomore year. I don't know. Freshman or sophomore year, I don't know.
Well,
but
that's early.
Even I just used the case in point of that. That happened I started undergrad in 2005. I sometimes, when I communicate that story, have said my freshman year, and I think it was my sophomore year, but I can't remember. But I'm not trying to deceive. It's like I can't remember which year it was, and I think about that in relationship to what we were just communicating about the Gospels.
That's a great illustration.
I'm not trying to deceive. It's just like sometimes I'm like, it all is a blur. Yep. It happened. I don't know if it was the 2005, 2006 class year, 2006, 2007 year, but I know that it happened. And so somebody could take two different recordings of me telling this story in the world, because, we're recorded everywhere, and say, oh, Lisa's lying, because in one aspect she said it was freshman year, another she said sophomore year. Literally. Right. Don't really know. I think it's more closer to sophomore, but it's this what happened. Right. And so when I think about reflecting on that as the gospel message, I think it's such a poignant illustration. But the point I was making, even going back to that, going to when we think about that, how can we make sense of the reliability with those two things about not adding to in Revelation? Yes. And then this cynical view of if they added this, they could add more things. Right.
Well, that's great. I mean, I like your example because it fits well in the sort of dynamic nature of storytelling and writing. So say you wrote down what you were telling me, and you were telling your story, or you wrote your story down about this happening in class and what you got exposed to. And then a friend of yours comes along who says, oh, I was in that class too, Lisa. And it went actually like this. And they started to add on a few things that happened that wouldn't change your story, but filled it out, right? You would say, oh, great, thank you. That's true. I left that out. Or they would just help to, figure out the picture, we wouldn't have any problem with that because we would say your original story wasn't like holy or sacred, right? So we would have no problem with it. But we have to keep in mind the dynamic nature of the way the New Testament was developing. So what we have now, which with a big title on the front, Holy Bible, was not necessarily the way it came about. As I said, it wasn't coming all intact. So it wasn't. So I don't think it's helpful to see it as adding to something when that something didn't exist as such. In other words, if we've got these Gospels that are written later even than Paul's letters, and somebody is adding on stories in the 2nd, 3rd century, even before we have something called the New Testament, this is all part of the process of clarifying something. So I guess for me, it may be not satisfying for all the students, but because they still see as this one thing that's intact, and then saying, oh, somebody added on to it. I'm saying it wasn't all intact. It was a bunch of manuscripts that were floating around and getting copied and being shared and being listened to and being taught. And over time, we had the question of, oh, which ones are the ones we save and which ones are the ones that we think were most, I was going to say most original. That doesn't make sense. But which one's original? Which one's the earliest? So those are questions that we come up with. But the I guess I've heard the cynical views, and for me, maybe it just happens that when I start to think of the Bible as a collection of documents rather than a book that was already intact that somebody tampered with, it's easier for me to think of a collection of documents getting refined over time than it is for me to think of a book that somebody then went over and said, let me fix it up, and started, tampering with it. So so that compilation over time, to me, oh, and by the way, that other question that you mentioned, like, what else could they have messed with? The thing is, we have these manuscripts. I mean, the manuscripts are there to show us where there's inconsistencies or variations of some sort. And so it's not, and most of the time, I mean, the vast majority, and Dan Wallace could probably give you the stats on it, but the vast majority of the time, none of us English readers of the Bible would even see it. And we just accept it because we've got these English translations. But there's a bunch of places all over where there's a spelling of a word and we're not sure if it's O-U-R, our, or Y-O-U-R, your, the way it comes out in English. So it's 1 John chapter 1, right around verse 4. We write these things to make your joy complete. Well, some translations, some versions say to make our joy complete. And we might say, are they trying to deceive us? No, somebody copied it funny. So now we've got this question of, is it our or your? Well, no big theological issue rests on that, but it does show you that there are human hands involved in copying. So nobody was adding words or trying to subtract words. They were simply copying things and trying to clarify them for the next generation of readers.
No, that's so helpful and clarifying. One of the things that I was reading a book on the Pentateuch, and they kind of described the word as almost like a hypostatic union, 100% God and 100% man.
Yeah.
And I don't want to sound like some people say, are you trying to be heretical? But it is this aspect that God used human hands to write a divine work. And we see those human hands reflected in the scribal errors we see in the copies. Is that a fair way to communicate that? I'm trying to avoid coming off like a heretic, but do you see what I'm trying to say? I'm not saying it fits neatly into, because Jesus is perfect and the scribal hands are imperfect, but I'm trying to give you a picture of the union of humanity and divinity merging for the book we have.
I think that's really good. And I'm much older than you, and I've had professors say the same thing in terms of thinking of the written word like we think of the divine word, John's word for Jesus, the Logos. I would say definitely. I mean, the way the New Testament talks about the Old Testament, and then the way later New Testament documents started to talk about itself, they were seeing the hand of God in this, even though they definitely were writing. I mean, look, I don't want to oversimplify and I don't want to muddy the waters, but just take the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. Luke says when he's writing this thing to Theophilus, he says, "It seemed good to me." It seemed good to me. He didn't say God told me. He said, "It seemed good to me to write for you an orderly account of these things." And he said, "Many people have tried to do this." I mean, we only got 4 Gospels, but he's acknowledging a bunch of people tried to, but he said, "I decided to write to you an orderly account, excellent Theophilus." He says, so he of the things that transpired. So Luke is saying in the beginning that I checked out sources. It seemed like a good idea to me, and I'm trying to do this for you and for your faith. Right? So he has pretty much said there's a human element here, and I'm doing this, and he even seems to suggest his own agency in the process. But what else we see in the Bible is this sense of God, by God's Spirit, superintending all of this. So we have this document that's put together with the Spirit's push, and I'll also say agency, but it doesn't deny the human in there. I mean, obviously God didn't need humans. God could have just wrote it in the sky, just the way, the writing on the wall back in Daniel, right? I mean, but God chose to use humans, so, and not as automatons of some sort of robots, but humans in all their humanness. So we have a human document written by human hands under the push of the Holy Spirit. I avoid sometimes in these kind of conversations using heavy words like inspiration, because then people fight over what that is. But I try to just simplify and say there was a push, a compulsion, a drive that the Holy Spirit put on them to do this, and the Holy Spirit superintended in some way, even though human beings were the ones who wrote these words. Mm-hmm.
Yes, so helpful. I think a good place to close out our conversations. This has been a rich conversation. For those who want to study a little bit of what we talked about and discussed here today, what are some books that you would recommend for them on the reliability of the Bible, textual criticism, all the things that you would say, hey, if you want to go deeper on this, because we have not even gone as far as we could go.
Haven't.
It would take days probably to and a whole course to even, and that wouldn't even scratch the surface of textual criticism and the reliability of the text. But what books can people start reading that would help them get
that's
more?
Interesting. It's funny. I'm looking over here on my shelf because I think a good introduction to the New Testament is always nice to start. David De Silva has a really nice one that's InterVarsity academic, IVP academic. I use that in a lot of my classes. And he has a good section on there on canon, on how the New Testament comes about. And then there's another one by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird. They put together a big introduction to the New Testament. Those are big books, right? But they're accessible. I mean, you can read them, and it would be clarifying. I was looking at and then there's one that's really straightforward by Mark Allen Powell. Also an introduction to the New Testament. The reason why I'm mentioning introductions is because it gives you, again, a sense of context. But there's a classic book on the canon by Bruce Metzger, who passed away not all that long ago. A book on canon, and I'm looking for the exact title. I was looking on my shelf. I don't see it handily. But I think it's just called Canon in the New Testament, or New Testament Canon. But and then there's books that talk about the textual criticism I mentioned, called a textual commentary on the New Testament. Those can get a little deep, but I would start with a New Testament introduction like the one by Powell or De Silva.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's helpful. And I would encourage even parents that are listening, if you have a child going off to college and they're going to a regular institution, and they might have a intro to New Testament or intro to religion class that may be freshman or sophomore year, it is good to prepare them with some of these intro to New Testament books.
Yeah, I think that's
you might not think that they want something that deep, but I always tell people, young people are actually in sometimes the best position to learn robust concepts than older people, because older people have been out of school for some time and they're not wrestling with complex things.
Yeah.
But younger people are in class, they're learning chemistry, geometry, calculus, history. They can actually engage some of these rigorous ideas in a more robust way than parents.
Yeah.
And so don't necessarily dumb it down, because if you dumb it down so much and you make it all about excitement, when they get to a class,
right,
like I was in the intro of New Testament, they're going to be overwhelmed, and whatever the professor says is what they're going to go with, because the professor has a PhD and they don't know anything else outside of that.
That's
and
good
so
point. Good point.
It is imperative, I think, that we equip our young people with the tools they need if you're going to send them off to a institution that may not have the Christian values you hold. So
well, I say amen. Yeah, it's always good to be prepared, and preparation includes good reading and research. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. How can people get in contact with you on social?
Oh, I'm almost everywhere at Rev Dr. Dre, REVDRDRE. I have a website, revdrdre.com. That's where I'm at on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
And you have a new book coming out.
I do. Thank you for mentioning that. I have a book called Humility Illuminated. It's with IVP Academic, and I do sort of like a biblical theology of humility, but I have a lot of practical examples that come out of my ministry experience, and hopefully it can be academically and exegetically rigorous, but at the same time engaging for how we do ministry and how we think about this virtue of humility. Thank you.
Awesome. And when does that come out?
It comes out in the fall of 2023, October, November, around there.
Okay. We'll have to have you back on to talk about,
I would love that.
About humility.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, you can catch all our past episodes at jude3project.org or subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast, or watch it on the YouTube or Facebook page. We're at Jude 3 Project everywhere. Remember, you could become a monthly partner financially by giving either online at jude3project.org. You can hit the donate button, and there'll be an option to give by mail. The address to where you make your check payable to, all of that is there. And then you can give online if you would like to do it electronically. Merch, our curriculums, the most recent one, Courageous Conversations and Unspoken, that goes with the documentary. You could get the Unspoken curriculum at unspokenmovie.com, and you can watch the documentary on Amazon Prime. You could get this on Amazon just by looking up Courageous Conversations. We appreciate your support. We always say every gift helps equip. So if you're a partner with us financially, you're helping us to further the mission and the vision of the Jude 3 Project. We could not do this without you. Until next time, grace and peace and God bless. And remember, here at the Jude 3 Project, we're helping you know what you believe and why you believe it. What's up, everyone? Lisa Fields here, and I'm so excited about our new curriculum, Courageous Conversations. You heard about our popular conference, Courageous Conversations, where we invite the leading pastors, thought leaders, and scholars from conservative and progressive backgrounds for conversations. But we not only want to have those conversations on stage at the conference, but we want you to have them in your everyday life. So we developed a curriculum for you to do just that. Courageous Conversations curriculum, the tools you need for the conversations in culture. You can get that today on Amazon or on our website at jude3project.org.